Last week, warning about the imminent arrival of Hurricane Helene, the National Weather Service in Tallahassee used the word unsurvivable. And yet, the storm seemed to take much of the country by surprise. You might have thought not that long ago that the arrival of extreme weather could wake us up belatedly from climate complacency, but the dull drumbeat of disaster seems almost to be putting us to sleep instead. Even the imminent arrival of a cataclysm like Helene, a category 4 storm that spanned more than 400 miles across the Gulf Coast and threatened communities as far north as Appalachia, was not enough to generate all that much attention ahead of time. When more might have been done to limit the devastation, the storm has so far produced at least 100 deaths and perhaps $160 billion in damage according to early estimates. In Florida's Big Bend region, Helene was the third hurricane to make landfall in barely a year, flattening beach towns and barrier islands and sending waters into the attics of homes as far away as Tampa Bay. In several states to the north, locals from dozens of communities hundreds of miles from one another were calling the storm our Katrina. Some of them watching the whole homes or shiny cascades carried downstream. Others clinging to tree branches for hours and end waiting for the floodwaters to recede or help to arrive. In Tennessee, there was no emergency declared before hospital patients were evacuated from a rooftop by helicopter. And as of Saturday, across western North Carolina, hundreds of vulnerable power substations were still down, along with the infrastructure and power lines meant to actually deliver electricity and the vast majority of the world's supplies of high purity quartz, a necessary input for the production of semiconductors. Dozens of coal ash ponds holding billions of tons of toxic coal ash have likely been flooded. Cars and trucks were tossed around like toys. 40 trillion gallons of rain fell off in total, the equivalent of one third of the total volume of Lake Erie, enough to cover the entire state of Massachusetts in 23 feet of water. The intense rainfall was made over the last week perhaps 50% more intense over parts of Georgia and the Carolinas by global warming. Other rapid assessments suggested it was perhaps only 20% more intense. Entire towns appear to have been turned into flotsam or pulverized into splinters, and few of those living in the hardest hit areas even carried flood insurance in Asheville, which sits hundreds of miles from the coastline and thousands of feet above sea level and is now the ground zero of the storm. The National Flood Insurance Program cover rate was under 1%. Across the country, as many as 6 million more homes are at severe risk of flooding than are even included on the federal government's flood risk maps. Michael Thomas pointed out in the aftermath of the storm, across Asheville's Buncombe County, 17 times as many homes had been judged at risk in 100 years. Flood event as carried insurance against that risk. Helene was called a 1,000-year flood for certain parts of the southeast, though those terms grow less meaningful almost by the day. Another ostensible 1,000-year storm had hit the coastal Carolinas just 1 week before sometimes worst-case scenarios really do come to pass. The climate scientist Daniel Swineworth over the weekend on Sunday, and I think we often lack the collective imagination to fully envision what that looks like. Americans watching disaster footage from a distance, collapsed bridge and disappear roads, Asheville submerged by sluggy brown floodwater. wonder how hurricanes might produce such devastation so far from shore so high up in the mountains. They use the words unprecedented and unthinkable and grimly recall silly rankings of so-called climate heavens, often produced in partnership with real estate broker, which named Asheville as a top choice destination for those seeking safety from extreme weather. In conservation and on social media, they suggest, as they had with floods in Vermont and orange skies in New York last summer, that the lesson of Helene is that nowhere is safe from climate disaster. An essay bearing that headline published in Politico was presented by Saffron. The real lessons may not be quite so grim, though it also demands more of us. Through the extent we might enjoy safety and stability in a world ever more pockmarked by climate impacts. It won't be because we casually circle heavens on maps, but because we built and designed them ourselves. Future with the storms carrying a whole region and passing perhaps a decade of recovery. But in the truth, as extraordinary as its devastation might seem, this kind of flooding in this kind of setting was not unthinkable or, for that matter, or even unprecedented. Indeed, it happened in western North Carolina in 1916 and Hurricane Camille in 1969 and Agnes in 1972 offered additional cautionary tales. For those with foreshortened memories, there was similarly spectacular flooding nearly simultaneously in Kathmandu, Nepal, on the other side of the planet, where nearly 150 have died and landslides have flattened a whole neighborhood after half a year's rain fell in 2 days in city twice as high up in the mountain and twice as far from the coast as Asheville. These days, even ambiguous news stories produce some amount of lamentation that nobody is covering this, since everyone loves to post media criticism. And in an endless scroll, it's easy enough to find a Sofian strawman. We heard a lot about social media's echo chamber, but its greatest trick is showing you stuff to get outraged about, including the partner in the friends of lack of interest of others. At first, over the weekend, word of Helene's devastation crisscrossed the country almost by whisper, in part because the few in position to observe the greatest damage firsthand, like cellular and internet connection with which to transmit their picture, and in part because national media hadn't quite anticipated in scale of destruction and local media through heroic was only capable of so much. Soon enough, the storm claimed a foothold on the country's front page and in the national consequences, but by then it was hard to escape the impression that as natural disaster and extreme weather events pile up in our feeds, they are somewhat losing their salience as a cultural force, producing a sense of ruptured reality than more quotidian description, even resonating from few as a perverse consequence of ubiquitousness, back-to-back hurricanes, thousand-year floods, the return of the urban firestorm. Many of these grim disasters seem to loom larger as horrifying long-term predictions than they do as actual presently living whole population demonstrated in their way. As Helene's floodwaters threaten it, liberals point to the threats to advise warning and disaster relief posed by Project 2025. emphasizing how uninterested in relief Donald Trump was as president. After Hurricane Matthew hit North Carolina, he released only 1% of the state's request relief, and he had hoped to cut the federal disaster response budget aggressively, proposing cuts to FEMA of more than 60%. Trump faulted President Biden for supposedly ignoring calls from Gov. Brian Kemp of Georgia last week, though Kemp in fact praised the president for his responsiveness, and across the political spectrum came criticism of state leaders and federal authorities, from those watching the humanitarian disaster in person through their phones and wanting to pin responsibility for it on emergency response in action. The thing is, there was action. Disaster response in a jury-rich patchwork, imperfect at best and deeply in need of reform, as the disasterologist Samantha Monanto, among others, has emphasized. But the tragedy of Helene is not that nobody arrived in its wake to help, because people have. The tragedy is that the storm did more than got there first. The pattern is by now familiar, but the country has seemingly chosen not to be prepared as much as grow inured. False, real, 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 real. Others, 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 weather, 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 beach, 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 flood, 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 new, 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 fission, 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 enough, 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 roads, 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 disappeared, 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 disappeared. Enough, 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 enough. In the continent, much, 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 much. Last, 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 last. Long, 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 long. Pin, 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 pin. Help, 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 help. Last, 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 last. Front, 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 front. Hoped, 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 hoped. But, 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 but. Last, 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 last. Front, 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 front. Dull, 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 dull. For example, in vowel, is it for real? Is it for real? And for consonant, I love you so much. Thank you.